state, and the hooks. These are the concept we'll be using to create our cards. Now, so far you've noticed that the card, this Pokemon card I've created, this is actually a hard-coded card. There is nothing dynamic in it, nothing's getting changed. I will take the Pokemon card and I will try to make it dynamic. Let's go to the Pokemon grid first, since that is the parent component. We'll design that first. I'll be using the Pokemon API. This API basically returns the first 150 original Pokemons. So if you go and paste this in your browser, you'll get this nice JSON with the names, Bulbasaur, Ivysaur, Venusaur, and there's respective URLs for fetching more details on them. Now inside this functional component, I will define some hooks to maintain the state that my component needs to have. Let's say, what do we need? We need the list of Pokemons that I just saw in my browser. State, and the initial state is it is an empty array. Now let's define a function to fetch that list. The syntax that I'm writing here is an arrow function. This is a part of modern JavaScript, the ES6 syntax. This is an async function, and the await makes sure, this keyword makes sure that when I'm fetching the API, the assignment of this variable only happens when the fetch call has completed. We get the response from it. Now at this point, if you do a console log, then you will see the value of Pokemons should be the value that we saw in your browser. I will also add an is loading function to it to make sure that the component only loads and the fetching of the API has completed. We create a variable called is Pokemon list loading. Using the naming convention of this variable, you will realize this is a Boolean variable I'm creating. Default value will be true, because initially the application will be loading, later it will be set to false. So after a fetch call is done, we'll call this, set the value of this variable to false, and then only if Pokemon list is not loading, we will return our component. Else, we will return text saying loading. Now let's create the property that I will be using to change my component. This is something called a prop. This is different from a state. So the value I'll be getting from those list of Pokemons, I'll take the first value and I'll pass it down to this component. Now let's go back to the Pokemon card. Now let's see what we're doing here. Inside the Pokemon card, now it has a set of variables that it itself manages, and it has a set of variables that is passed down to the component. That is called props or properties for the component, or you can also call it parameters for the component. Now we'll be making another API call here, so let's have loading function for it also. And as we saw in the API, there is a URL that it provides for fetching the Pokemon details. Okay, so what did I do here? Inside the grid, I made this API call, I made this fetch call. Inside that, this thing got stored using the get Pokemons call inside Pokemons using the set Pokemons hook. Now Pokemons contains the list of my Pokemons. Inside that, I just passed the first Pokemon to my Pokemon card component which contains a name and a URL. So I'll use props that are coming in. My props has a Pokemon variable that I just passed to it, which has a URL, which I'll be using to make the next fetch call. Then I'll get some data from it. We'll set Pokemon data to the API response, and we'll set loading false, because at this point our loading will be done. Inside use effect, we'll add this. Instead of the name, now since we are getting the props, inside props we have a Pokemon as a name property. Now this name is getting dynamically rendered. This is actually not something I've hard coded anywhere. Now again, we will only show our component when our loading is done. So if that we're still loading. This is to avoid errors later in the application. Okay, so there are three things here. Now I implemented three things. I used hooks to manage my component state. So that was the state that the component itself maintained, and I used props as a way to change my component. So if I go to Pokemon Grid now and I see this component is actually something I can change. This is a reusable component. So if I pass Bulbasaur's data to it, it renders Bulbasaur. If I change this, say I give it the second thing from the list, it will render Ivysaur. So this is a reusable component I've created. So that was it for props, state and hooks.